The last quilt was the heaviest. Mayue shifted its weight in her arms, the thick wool and cotton batting a dead anchor against the wind that sought to tear it from her grasp. The cold bit through her worn gloves, a familiar ache that had settled deep in her bones weeks ago. Ahead, the solitary cabin seemed to suck the last of the gray afternoon light into its dark log walls, a smudge of smoke rising from its stone chimney, the only sign of life for miles. This was her final stop. If this failed, she would have to turn the wagon back toward Redemption Gulch, a town whose name felt more like a cruel joke with each passing day. The man who lived here was a name spoken in careful whispers: Arthur Bishop. They said he was a gunslinger, a man with a past that clung to him like the winter cold. They said he sought solitude and did not welcome visitors. But the store owner had mentioned him with a grudging respect, noting that Bishop always paid his debts in cash and on time. A man who paid his debts might just be a man who would buy a quilt. Ghosts and stories couldn't keep her warm, but a thick, well-stitched blanket could. And she had two mouths to feed, her own and the stubborn gray mule tethered to the wagon, whose breath plumed in the freezing air. She wore a dark green dress, the high collar and side fastenings a quiet testament to a life she had left behind across an ocean. It was made of sturdy wool, not silk, a practical garment for a harsh land, yet it marked her as other, a solitary figure in a landscape that did not know what to make of her. She had 4 quilts left, the last of her winter's work. Each stitch was a prayer for survival, a tiny knot holding her precarious life together. As she drew closer, the cabin door opened. The man who emerged was tall, broad in the shoulder, and moved with a deliberate stillness that seemed at odds with the frantic wind. His face was weathered, carved by sun and hardship, and his eyes, a pale, clear gray, missed nothing. They took in the quilt in her arms, the overloaded wagon, the weary slump of the mule, and finally, her. She braced herself for dismissal, for the curt wave of a hand that would send her back into the encroaching dusk. She stopped a respectable distance from the porch. "Sir," she began, her voice steadier than she felt, "I'm selling quilts, to prepare for the winter." He said nothing for a long moment. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. Then he stepped off the porch, his boots sinking slightly into the thin layer of snow. He walked not to her, but to the wagon, and with a surprising gentleness lifted the corner of the oilcloth covering her wares. He ran a large, calloused hand over the top quilt, a pattern of interlocking squares in shades of brown and faded gold. He tested the weight of it, felt the density of the batting between his thumb and forefinger. He did this with a solemn focus, as if judging the quality of a fine horse or a well-made saddle. He seemed to understand the labor, the hundreds of hours her needle had flown through the tough fabric. Finally, he looked up, his gaze meeting hers. "How much?" His voice was a low rumble, rough like burlap. She named her price for one, the number feeling both too large and terrifyingly small. It was what she needed to buy flour, salt, and feed for the mule for another 2 weeks. He nodded slowly, his eyes moving over the other 3 quilts stacked neatly behind the first. "And for all 4? The question caught her off guard. "Sir?" "All of them," he repeated, his gaze unwavering. "What is the price?" She did the calculation in her head, her heart beginning to beat a nervous, hopeful rhythm against her ribs. She told him the total, a sum that felt like a fortune. He didn't haggle. He didn't question the value. He simply reached into the pocket of his worn coat and pulled out a leather pouch. He counted out the silver coins into his palm, the metal gleaming dully in the failing light. He walked over and placed the coins directly into her hand. They were heavy, real. more money than she had held at one time since her husband, Gian, had been alive. "Thank you," she whispered, curling her fingers around the coins. She turned to begin the process of unloading the heavy quilts, but as she did, the wind shifted, carrying with it the first hard pellets of snow. They stung her cheeks, sharp and biting. "Storm's closing in," Arthur Bishop said. It was not a guess, it was a statement of fact. He looked toward the mountains, now completely obscured by a curtain of swirling white. "The trail back to town will be gone in an hour. You won't make it." She knew he was right. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at her. To be caught in a blizzard on the open trail was a death sentence. He watched her for a moment, then gestured with his head toward the lean-to attached to the side of the cabin. "Put your mule under cover. There's hay and water." He turned back toward the warmth of his home. "You can stay for supper. Wait out the worst of it." The offer hung in the air between them, a complication she hadn't foreseen, a kindness she didn't know how to accept, and a necessity she could not refuse. He was a stranger, a man with a dangerous reputation, but the storm was a more certain kind of danger. She looked at the solid weight of the coins in her hand, then at the sturdy cabin door he held open for her. She had come to sell him comfort in the form of a blanket, and he was now offering her the same in the form of shelter. With a quiet nod, she led the mule toward the lean-to, the world already disappearing behind a thick white veil. The cabin was one room, spare and meticulously clean. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, throwing dancing shadows on the log walls. A simple cot was pushed against one wall, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs in the center. There were no decorations, no clutter, just the essential items for a life lived alone. Yet it was warm, and the scent of wood smoke and brewing coffee was a welcome balm against the storm's fury, which now howled outside like a hungry animal. Mayue stood uncertainly by the door, her hands clasped in front of her. Arthur Bishop moved about the small space with an economy of motion, adding a log to the fire, checking a pot that simmered on the hearth. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it was heavy, filled with the unasked questions of 2 strangers thrown together by a blizzard. He gestured to one of the chairs at the table. "Sit," he said. "The stew is almost ready." She obeyed, perching on the edge of the chair. She watched him work. For a man they called a gunslinger, his hands were steady and capable as he sliced a loaf of dark bread. There was a pistol, she noticed, hanging in a worn leather holster from a peg by the door, but it seemed more like a forgotten tool than a ready threat. He owned this space completely, yet there was a deep weariness in the set of his shoulders, a solitude that went bone deep. He placed a steaming bowl of venison stew in front of her, along with a thick slice of bread. He sat opposite her and began to eat, his focus on his food. She took a tentative spoonful. The stew was rich and hot, and she realized with a pang how deeply hungry she was. They ate without speaking, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against pottery and the roar of the wind outside. Just as they were finishing, a loud, insistent banging on the door made them both look up. It was not the knock of a friendly neighbor. Arthur's face hardened. He rose from his chair, his movements fluid and silent, and went to the door. He didn't open it all the way, just enough to see who was outside. A man stood on the porch, shaking snow from the shoulders of an expensive-looking coat. He was handsome in a predatory way, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Bishop," the man said, his voice smooth and condescending. "A terrible night. I was just on my way back to town and thought I'd make my final offer in person." The man's eyes slid past Arthur and landed on Mayue. His smile tightened, a flicker of distaste crossing his features. "Well, well, I see you've found some company. Didn't take you for the type." Arthur did not react to the jibe. He simply blocked the doorway with his body. "My answer is the same as it was last week, Vance. The land is not for sale." The man, Vance, chuckled. "Everything is for sale, Bishop. It's just a matter of price. The railroad is planning a spur line through this valley. My associates on the Territorial Council are very keen to see this land developed. An isolated homestead claim from a man with your history is an inconvenience they are prepared to remove, one way or another." The politeness in his tone was a thin veneer over a hard threat. "I'm offering you a generous price, more than this worthless patch of rock is worth. Take it, or you'll be left with nothing." Arthur Bishop remained perfectly still. The firelight caught the hard planes of his face. When he spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. "I recall a situation in Abilene, Sterling," he said, using the man's first name with chilling familiarity. "A cattle contract and some missing signatures. The brand on the cattle didn't quite match the one on the deed. A man could get into a lot of trouble for something like that, especially if a federal marshal started asking questions." Sterling Vance's condescending smile vanished. A flicker of something that looked like fear crossed his face before he masked it with anger. He had not expected this quiet homesteader to know the specific details of his dirty laundry. "You're making a mistake," Vance snarled, his composure broken. He took a step back from the door. "A big one." He threw one last venomous glare at Arthur and then at Mayue before turning and disappearing into the swirling snow. Arthur closed the door, the heavy bolt sliding home with a solid thud. The sudden quiet in the cabin was immense. Mayue's heart was hammering. She had just witnessed a battle fought not with guns, but with memory and carefully chosen words. The man who had been a quiet, almost shy host a moment before had transformed into someone else entirely, a man who could stop another cold with nothing but his voice. He had not only defended his home, he had, in a way, defended her presence within it. He did not look at her. He walked back to the hearth and stared into the flames, his back to her. The tension in his shoulders was still there. "He won't be back tonight," Arthur said, his voice low again. "But a man like that doesn't forget." Mayue looked around the small, warm cabin, a temporary sanctuary from the storm. She realized now that the blizzard was the least of the dangers surrounding this place. The real threat was a man in a fine coat with powerful friends, and he had just been given a reason to hate Arthur Bishop even more. And she, by her simple presence, was now part of the story. The storm raged for 2 full days. The world outside the cabin's single window was a churning chaos of white, erasing the landscape and isolating them completely. Inside, a quiet, unspoken rhythm developed. Arthur tended the fire and the animals, venturing out into the blizzard for short, necessary trips to the lean-to. Mayue, finding a small mending kit in her satchel, repaired a tear in one of her quilts. She insisted on helping, sweeping the floor and keeping the kettle full on the hearth. They moved around each other in the confined space with a careful, considerate grace. They spoke little, but the silence was no longer heavy with uncertainty. It had become a shared space, a quiet understanding. In the evening of the second day, as he sat cleaning a piece of tack and she sat by the fire, he finally broke the quiet. "Why quilts?" he asked, his eyes on his work. She paused her sewing, the needle still in the fabric. She thought of how to explain a life's worth of choices to this stranger. "My husband, Gian, he worked for the railroad," she said, her voice soft. "He was strong. He believed in the promise of the Gold Mountain. He died when a trestle bridge collapsed. The company called it an act of God." She looked down at her hands. "They gave me $20 in his last pay packet. It was not enough to get back to California. Not enough for anything, really." She continued, the story unfolding simply. I can sew. My mother taught me. In our village, a woman's skill with a needle was a measure of her worth. I sold my jewelry, what little I had, to buy fabric, batting, and thread. I made the quilts because it is the only thing I know how to do that a man cannot take from me. It is the only thing that is truly mine." He stopped his work and looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He saw not just a foreign woman in a strange dress, but the fierce, quiet determination that had kept her alive. After a long moment, he set aside the leather he was working on. He rose and went to a large, plain, wooden chest at the foot of his cot. He lifted the heavy lid and took out a small, worn leather pouch. He brought it back to the table and untied the drawstring. From inside, he carefully slid a daguerreotype in a tarnished silver frame. He pushed it across the table toward her. It was a portrait of a woman with kind eyes and a tired smile, her arm around a small boy who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. The boy was missing a front tooth. "My wife, Sarah," Arthur said, his voice thick with a rusty grief. "And my son, Thomas." He traced the edge of the frame with his finger. "Fever. Took them both in the winter of '72. We had a small farm back in Missouri. After they were gone, the silence. I couldn't stand the silence in that house." He looked away, toward the fire. "So I left. Thought if I kept moving I could outrun it. I wore a badge for a while, a U.S. Marshal. I thought putting bad men away would make some kind of sense of it all." He shook his head slowly. "But men like Vance, they use the law like a club. It's not about right and wrong, it's about power. I got tired of being a part of it. I came here for the quiet. Turns out you can't outrun anything." He finally looked back at her. "Sarah, she made quilts. Not as fine as yours. Her stitches were crooked, but they were warm." He had shared the core of his pain, the secret that animated his solitude. In that moment they were no longer a gunslinger and a frightened widow. They were just two people who had lost everything, trying to build a life from the pieces that were left. A fragile bridge of understanding stretched across the table between them, built of shared loss and the quiet dignity of survival. On the morning of the third day, the world was born anew. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of profound silence and blinding white brilliance. The sky was a sharp, cloudless blue. After a breakfast of coffee and the last of the bread, Mayue knew it was time to leave. She packed her few belongings, her heart a strange mixture of gratitude and reluctance. As she was leading the mule out of the lean-to, Arthur came to stand beside her. "You should be able to make it back to town now," he said. "The drifts will be deep, but the trail should be visible." Before she could thank him, they both froze. The sound of riders, their horses crunching through the fresh snow, carried clearly on the cold air. 3 men crested the small hill that overlooked the cabin. The man in the lead was Sterling Vance. Beside him was the portly, red-faced territorial sheriff from Redemption Gulch. Vance had a triumphant smirk on his face. He'd wasted no time. They reined in their horses a few yards away. The sheriff, a man who clearly enjoyed his authority, dismounted. He held up a piece of paper. "Arthur Bishop," he announced, his voice booming in the stillness. "I have a warrant of eviction. There's been a challenge filed against your homestead claim. Says here your original filing was improper. You have 24 hours to vacate the property." Arthur's face was a mask of cold fury. "That claim is legal, Sheriff, signed and sealed by the land office in Prescott." "According to Mr. Vance here, who has filed a competing claim, there was a procedural error," the sheriff said, not meeting Arthur's eyes. He was a puppet, and Vance was pulling the strings. "It's a legal matter now. You'll have to take it up with the territorial judge when he makes his circuit in the spring. Until then, the property is contested. You have to leave." It was a perfect trap. By spring, Vance would have his spur line and Arthur's claim would be buried under a mountain of legal paperwork. The sheriff's gaze fell on Mayu. "And you," he said dismissively, "you best get that wagon off this land before I charge you with trespassing." This was her exit, her chance to escape. She could nod, get in her wagon, and drive away from this trouble that was not her own. She could go back to her solitary struggle, anonymous and safe. Vance watched her, expecting her to scurry away like a frightened mouse, but she didn't move. She looked at Arthur, standing alone against three men who represented the kind of casual, crushing power that had left her a widow. She looked at the smug certainty on Vance's face. Something inside her, a quiet ember of defiance she thought had long gone cold, began to glow. She took a deliberate step away from her wagon, then another. She walked across the snow-covered ground and stood on the cabin porch, just a step behind Arthur Bishop. She said nothing. She didn't have to. Her position was a silent declaration. She had chosen her side. The sheriff grunted, annoyed by the complication. "The claim needs a secondary witness signature to be contested, Bishop," he said, his patience wearing thin. "And seeing as you live out here alone, you don't have one." Arthur's jaw was tight. He was beaten. The law, twisted as it was against him. It was then that Mayue spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the cold, clean air with absolute clarity. "I can read," she said. The three men turned to look at her, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. "My husband taught me," she continued, her gaze fixed on the paper in the sheriff's hand. "Let me see the document." 3 months later, the last of the snow had retreated to the high peaks, and the valley floor was alive with the tender green of early spring. Mayue's wagon was parked permanently beside the cabin, its canvas cover bleached pale by the winter sun. Her mule, fat and content, grazed in a newly fenced pasture that ran down to the creek. The document the sheriff had carried that day was a clever forgery, but not a perfect one. Sterling Vance, in his arrogance, had made a mistake. The date he had put on his fraudulent claim, the day he supposedly filed it at the territorial office, was a date Mayu knew Arthur could not have been there. It was the day he had traveled to the next county to buy seed grain, and he had the signed and dated receipt to prove it. Her literacy, the skill no one in that yard had expected a Chinese woman to possess, had been the key that unlocked the trap. Faced with a calm, literate witness and irrefutable proof of his own timeline, Arthur had forced the sheriff's hand. The lawman, unwilling to be caught in an obvious conspiracy, had backed down, leaving Vance humiliated and exposed. Word of Vance's fraudulent land schemes, now under investigation by federal authorities, had spread through the territory. He had long since fled, his power in the valley broken. The whispers in Redemption Gulch had changed. They no longer spoke of the reclusive gunslinger. They spoke of the strange and formidable partnership at the Bishop homestead. They spoke of the Chinese widow who had faced down Sterling Vance without a weapon, and they spoke of the exquisite quilts that were now being shipped by freight wagon as far as Denver and Santa Fe. Their life had found a new rhythm. Arthur handled the business in town, the freight shipments, the bank drafts. He was the public face of their enterprise. Mayu was its heart. She managed the orders that came by mail and telegraph, purchased supplies, and stitched for hours each day, her creations a vibrant counterpoint to the rugged landscape outside. The cabin had changed too. Bright patchwork curtains hung in the window. A small kitchen garden, tilled and planted by them both, was beginning to sprout near the porch. It was no longer his shelter, but their home. One evening, as dusk settled over the valley, Arthur came inside from the evening chores. The air smelled of damp earth and new leaves. Mayu was sitting by the fire, not sewing, but simply looking into the flames. On the small table beside her she had laid out 2 quilts. One was the old, slightly crooked one his wife Sarah had made years ago. The other was one of her own, a breathtaking pattern of deep blues and greens that seemed to hold the colors of the twilight sky. He came and stood behind her chair, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. She leaned into his touch, a simple gesture of comfort and belonging that had become their language. He had come to this valley seeking silence, a place to bury the man he had been. He hadn't understood that he was not seeking an end, but waiting for a reason to begin again. She had come to his door simply trying to survive the winter. She hadn't known she was looking for a place where she would finally be seen for all that she was. Looking at the two quilts side by side, one a memory of a life that was lost, and the other a promise of a life being built, he knew they had both found what they were looking for. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.